Hello and welcome to World Talks. I'm Anna Kalczyńska. Join me on this conversation about Zapad exercises and security challenges for the region. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has announced the launch of Eastern Sentry, a new military initiative aimed at reinforcing NATO's posture along its eastern flank. The announcement comes just days after Poland scrambled fighter jets to intercept Russian drones near the border, forcing a temporary closure of airspace over Lublin. At the same time, Russia and Belarus have begun Zapad 25, one of their largest joint exercises, deploying Iskander missile systems within striking range of Poland. Joining me to discuss what this means for NATO readiness and deterrence is Joshua Burgin, founder of Alliance for Global Security. Good evening, sir. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me tonight.
So let's start with an address by the Polish Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of National Defense, Władysław Kosiniak-Kamysz. Let's have a listen.
NATO gives a tough, clear answer. Its Eastern Sentry mission is such an answer. And there are declarations of support from 8 countries that we've seen so far. That's the latest number. But others are preparing to offer similar declarations. So this is very serious and probably will be one of the biggest operations in NATO history. We are building a national, multi-layer air defense system, supplemented at this time by the extraordinary support from the Eastern Sentry mission and the actions of our allies. This will include aircraft and helicopters, equipment deployed on the ground, ground-based anti-aircraft and anti-missile platforms, as well as counter-drone systems.
So looking at the pattern of Russian drone incursion, missiles deployment, hybrid attacks, what is really Moscow trying to achieve? What is its strategy? How do you read it? Is it calculated to provoke Poland? Is it the air forces? Or it's a long run eroding public confidence?
Well, I think if we look at it in totality, this is the latest instance within Polish territory with the drone attacks is just one of many areas in which Russia is probing the defenses of Europe, the defenses of NATO. And frankly, while they may see unanimity and responsive message, they're not seeing the sort of response that's going to cause them to change. Europe wants to continue to have rule of law and all the normative behaviors. Meanwhile, it's sitting on $300 billion or thereabouts of Russian assets that, frankly, in my view, this recent drone strike should be the last straw. Perhaps not the heaviest, and the heaviest straw didn't break the camel's back necessarily, but this should be a place in which Europe says, okay, enough is enough, whether it was intended or not, no matter what they say, as Russia consistently denies everything, concedes nothing, now is the time to force them to understand that this is a consequence. I'm glad about what's happening in terms of the unanimity of the 8 NATO nations in building a multi-layered defense structure. But when is Russia going to ultimately pay a price?
Exactly. So the maneuvers known as Zapad drills will last until Tuesday. Donald Tusk describes them as very aggressive form and from a military doctrine perspective. But given the proximity of Zapad drills to NATO territory and the presence of nuclear-capable systems, how close are we to a genuine escalation scenario, in your view?
Well, I mean, let's ask the question, what in the world is Zapad 2025 for? There's an active hot war going on right now in Ukraine, with a nation state that has sort of ignored all the normative rules, continues to hit civilian targets as a primary course of action, not a secondary, and yet they're now going to run a military exercise with Belarus and expect their neighbors to think, oh, we come in peace. We've heard that story before.
You mentioned it previously, but is NATO politically ready for this escalation scenario, and is NATO ready to respond should such a next incident causes casualties on Polish soil, for instance?
Well, I think that NATO is one, indispensable, but two, its leadership often lacks the courage and the ability to lock arms with each other to make meaningful change. At the beginning of this latest iteration of Russia's war on Ukraine, we watched as most of the major Western European powers were reluctant to sort of change the status quo of business. You had Germany sending 5,000 white helmets. You had, Macron going to Moscow to negotiate while being disrespected by the president of Russia. I've never had concerns around Poland or Romania, for instance. They've always been quite hawkish, while much of Western Europe has said, "Oh, come on, calm down. It's not that big of a deal," when in fact it is a big deal. And at this stage, we're watching a scenario in which Washington is a bit less hawkish than they have been classically, which is a bit of an understatement, but nevertheless, we can see that. And the Europeans appear to me to still be looking for a savior or to score points with Washington. Arm yourself, create a prickly porcupine sort of effect, as Poland has done around the continent, provide the weapons needed. I mean, if we look at the whole of NATO, we're still producing less artillery rounds than Russia is on an annualized basis. And we have, God knows how much bigger economy. Russia's sitting the effect of Italy, and we have two of the largest economies in the world if we combine these two, and we're not able to produce a similar number of shells. We also lack the sort of allies that Russia has through China, North Korea, and Iran that are just as equally interested in disrupting the world as we currently know it. And this should cause all of us to have a sudden wake up call and understand that the time for diplomatic norms and playing the traditional games of careful language may not be enough if we have aggressive adversaries that are allied together, collaborating in ways never before. I mean, those drones that hit Poland have Chinese parts. And yet recently I saw a headline that they're celebrating the fact that Poland had its first train ever roll into China. How does this work? This interconnected nature? It seems as though the bad guys are getting all the benefit, and the good guys are reluctant to do anything that might disrupt the economic flows while undermining their own security in the process.
Well, how does it work? We'll see. We're just about to see, as on Monday, the Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs pays a visit to Warsaw. But the question is, as you pointed out very rightly, are we willing to wake up and simply with this less hawkish, as you mentioned, stance of Washington, how much does this U.S. hesitation, I don't know how to describe it, political paralysis, can affect the credibility of our deterrence?
Well, certainly every day that the White House has failed to call out the Russians for what at the very least appears to be an attack on the part of the Russians. If it's a mistake, then apologize, acknowledge it was a mistake, acknowledge it happened, and just say, "Hey, that our bad. We didn't." But no, in fact, they've consistently denied it. No, the capacity wasn't there. They couldn't have gotten this far. Poland is exaggerating, but I'm certain Poland has the evidence. Every day that Washington delays to put out a firm response to this is a day that Putin is more empowered. And it's not just me saying this. Dr. Andrew Mikta, who spent many years at the Marshall Center and is currently teaching at the Hamilton School at the University of Florida, made exactly this point yesterday on Twitter.
Right, so Putin is betting that NATO will not escalate. So what are we ready to do, Washington, Brussels, Warsaw, other places, to prove Putin wrong?
So I think that there's fear of escalation, and not every sort of response or not every consequence necessarily has to be escalation. As I've already pointed to, there's a few $100 billion sitting in European banks. And while I understand that the business heads and even some of the political heads in Europe would like to maintain the status quo there and not undermine this sort of respect for rule of law and the notions around the banking system, these times may call for those sorts of measures. And a consequence of not just using the proceeds of the interest from those funds to fund Ukraine, but in fact, taking those entire funds, considering them a consequence of an unjust war, as unjust provocation, as unjust sort of hacking of cybersecurity systems, arson that is that our intelligence services have demonstrated to come from the Russians, and just say, look, we're taking this as a payment, as a cost for your bad behavior, and we're going to build our munitions and our defense systems, and we're going to fund Ukraine to do everything they possibly can to defeat you. This, to me, is not an escalation. This is simply a matter of consequence.
Well, but so far, Belgium just ruled it out. They consider this option as not valid. So let's put it aside for the time being, at least. We'll see how that evolves. We understand that the Eastern Sentry is meant to be a show of force. So it's basically a deterrence. And Poland has been on the front line of every recent escalation, from migrant crisis to the recent drone incidents. So based on the latest developments of the recent days, how well Poland is integrated, in your opinion, into NATO's early warning? Do you see any gaps here?
So I think that absolutely that Poland is the tip of the spear, not just geographically, but with a solid understanding of the adversary that whether we want Russia to be an adversary or not, they are presenting themselves as an adversary to the Western world. Poland understands this. Poland has experienced this. Every Polish person I've met over the years can usually speak to chapter and verse, the grave offenses that Russia is committing today, and almost always they can close the conversation with, and by the way, they hurt my family 50 to 100 years ago. So in this sense, I think Poland is not only instinctively right, but it has taken absolutely the correct course of action of spending nearly 5% of annual GDP to put the military equipment, put the training in place, and to create a civil military setup of resilience to push back against and to know that they can. I mean, Russia would be foolish to ever cross the border in a traditional way. So again, we go back to that notion of the drone strike, whether it was an accident or intentional, we may never know, but it's their way of provoking. To this most recent alliance, again, the 8 that have signed on, these efforts at defensive deterrence, I think, are effective to a certain extent. And I think in the same way that Zapad is perhaps a joint exercise beyond simply defensive measures, but sort of a joint operation in which we see high numbers of European forces drilling together along the Baltics and in Poland and the Visegrad, may go even further to signal we're not just prepared for defense, but the best defense is a good offense, and we can do that too if ever called upon.
All right, we've just discussed the present reaction, the current reaction. Let's talk long game now. If Russia continues its strategy of salami slicing and constantly provoking for months or even years, what should be the NATO's long-term strategy vis-à-vis Moscow?
Well, I think we should assume that. I think we should assume that Russia is going to continue to provoke until it officially loses a conflict or a contest in Ukraine. The notion that we've seen such feet dragging across the NATO alliance, including in Washington under the previous administration, and now the current sort of posture in the U.S., I should give all of us pause, because again, Russia has not ever really gotten anything other than perhaps a yellow light. Oh yes, they've lost countless troops, but this doesn't represent a real cost to Putin. The long-term strategy is to assume that this is going to continue, to build military capacity, and to demonstrate a willingness not just to build it, but to potentially use it. That is not to be rash. That is not to create an actual war. But I think that Russia doesn't actually want such a war. At the end of the day, these are rational actors. It's not like other parts of the world where you have jihadists or those that are driven by some sort of a religious fervor. Russia wants to live and be successful, and where they feel like they cannot get there or they're under actual peril or threat, they back down. And I think this is the problem, is that many of our Western leaders have gone to Ivy League or similar schools where the rationale of I'm okay, you're okay, let's negotiate for mutual benefit. And they do not have the option of studying in these environments how to counter zero sum. And Russia's mindset out of the Kremlin, and that frankly out of Beijing as well, tends to be zero sum. In order for us to look good, you must look bad. Therefore, they're always looking for opportunities to demonstrate, one, superiority in their ability to engage in either sabotage or hybrid operations, but also to humiliate the leaders in the West. And until the Western leaders understand this and recognize this, I think that Russia is going to continue, because they, in one way or another, are being rewarded for doing so.
Don't you think that we are risking normalizing Russian pressure here in such a scenario?
I don't think that Russia is. I mean, Russia's normalizing Russia's pressure. I mean, frankly, if we look back across the last 20 years, Russia has been through a proxy effort, i.e., they call them criminal gangs, but criminal gangs they're unwilling to pursue. They've been hacking and stealing from banks and all sorts of institutions, literally hundreds of billions of dollars, probably on the order of $1 trillion to $2 trillion in the last 20 years. And except for a group of inside baseball players who track this and pay attention, there's never been a substantive response to that. There's never been a counter. Literally, the son of a Russian member of parliament was implicated in a up to a $300 billion heist, and was ultimately arrested by the U.S. But it never became sort of household news. If that happened in the reverse, sort of the son or daughter of a Polish member of parliament or an American member of Congress implicated in a $100 million heist of Russian assets, they would scream absolute bloody murder. And so I think to some extent or other, Russia will continue in its posture of hybrid provocations, using every tool of sort of their dark arts that they've been developing for the past 100 years, until the Western world goes ahead and definitively says enough is enough and puts a stop to it. And I think Ukraine is the best way to do that. And yet, for reasons that we can spend hours talking about, there's always somebody who's unwilling to. As you mentioned, Belgium earlier. We have Hungary that plays this game, and now in certain instances, Washington. And this, to me, is incredibly problematic. I will pause with this thought, but I look back to the days ahead of the war in Ukraine, when much of Europe was skeptical, even Ukraine was skeptical. And this was the moment in which the picture that we saw last week, where the Chinese leader was ahead of that group of people, should have been demonstrated on the streets of Kyiv ahead of Russia's assault,
And
as Western leaders unified together and said, "We will not stand you crossing a border."
And this is where we put a pause. Thank you so much, Joshua Burgin, founder of the Alliance for Global Security. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for your expertise this evening.
Well, thank you for having me tonight.
And thank you for watching World Talks. This is TVP World. I'm Anna Kalczynska. Thank you for watching, and see you soon.